the dim beginning of a girl's life. In the earliest hours of dawn, when the mist still clung to the ragged thatched rooftops and the muddy lanes of the village glistened with the remnants of the night's chill, a girl would take her first frail breaths in a world that had already measured her worth. She came into being beneath the low rafters of a timbered hall, or perhaps within the cold hush of a stone manor, her mother pale and spent, her father pacing the shadows with an expression caught between disappointment and practicality. In medieval Europe, to be born female was to inherit a life already defined by invisible boundaries, boundaries laid down by custom, law, and the unsparing decrees of the church. Her infancy was a fragile span, a thin, flickering candle in the dark. Many never survived those first months, succumbing to the quiet threats that hovered over every cradle. Fevers without names, chills that settled in tiny lungs, infections no prayer or poultice could cure. If she made it to her first birthday, she might be regarded with a tempered relief, but little celebration. Her survival did not alter her standing as a liability, a mouth to feed, a dowry to save for, a body destined to be traded away like a sheaf of grain when the time was judged right. In the hush of her early days, she would be swaddled in linens, washed by the same hands that stirred the pottage pot and scraped the hearth clean. She would be rocked in arms, calloused by endless work, fed from a breast already drained by other children's needs. There was no nursery as we would recognize it, no toys, no softness beyond what scraps of fabric and bits of wood could be fashioned into crude amusements. A wooden spoon to clutch, a length of wool to twist between her tiny fingers. In some families, the birth of yet another daughter might be greeted with resignation or even scorn. Some chronicles tell of infants quietly abandoned or neglected, though such endings were whispered about, never spoken aloud in the clear light of day. Meanwhile, in the halls of nobility, a girl's arrival might inspire more elaborate ritual, but no greater autonomy. A midwife would wrap her in fine cloth and pronounce her healthy or weak. A priest would record her name and mark her forehead with holy water, invoking a blessing that would do little to protect her from the merciless expectations already waiting. Her family's ambitions would gather around her like invisible attendants, tallying her future worth as a pawn in dynastic arrangements. A lord's daughter was seldom more free than a peasant's. She was simply more carefully watched. The days and seasons of her infancy unfolded against a backdrop of toil that scarcely paused to acknowledge her. Her mother would carry her close while mending nets or spinning wool. She would lie in a cradle near the open hearth, soot drifting onto her face, the heat too close in summer, too remote in winter. When she cried, she was hushed quickly, because a crying child disrupted the fragile semblance of order in a household stretched thin by survival. By the time she could walk, there was no notion that her childhood was a protected interval. She was, in every sense, a small adult in the making, expected to observe, to imitate, to absorb her place in the scheme of things. The simple fact of her existence had already bound her to a future that no ounce of innocence could defer. For every girl, the path ahead was a narrow one. Obedience, modesty, labor. Few strayed far from it without consequence. Perhaps in the early evenings when the chores were finally done and the smoky air cooled, she might have found a small corner of peace, a moment when her mother or grandmother recited a soft fragment of scripture or legend, a story about a sainted queen or a woman of virtue who had earned some measure of divine grace. But even these tales were threaded through with reminders. To be a woman was to submit, to endure, to atone for the sins of Eve. Her moral worth would be measured by her silence, her docility, her usefulness. From these dim beginnings, she would learn, almost by osmosis, that her body was not quite her own, that her thoughts were not meant to be spoken, that her desires, if she ever dared to name them, were dangerous things to be locked away. She would watch the older girls, already bent to their duties, already resigned. And somewhere in her small, untested heart, she would begin to understand the shape of her inheritance, a life circumscribed by the will of others. The knowledge would grow quietly, like a seed pressed into the cold earth, waiting. And you might wonder, as you picture her in the flickering half-light of that medieval dwelling, what she dreamed of in those first years, whether she ever imagined there could be another kind of life waiting beyond the walls that held her in. The vanishing childhood. In the medieval world, the idea of childhood as a time of carefree exploration was little more than a comforting fiction, one that scarcely existed outside the pages of later centuries. For a girl born into the layered hierarchies of feudal Europe, childhood was not a protected sanctuary, but a brief, unceremonious passage, over almost as soon as she had learned to steady her steps. From the moment her hands were strong enough to carry a jug of water or thread a needle, she was enlisted into the rhythms of adult labor, the soft outlines of youth dissolving into the stern shape of duty. The days that marked her transition were not commemorated by any grand rite of passage. Instead, her obligations accumulated gradually, like drifts of snow against a door. At first, she might be tasked with small errands, fetching kindling, tending a younger sibling, plucking feathers from a slaughtered hen. But these modest duties soon grew into a full share of the household burden. To be idle was to be suspect. A girl who did not keep busy was thought to harbor mischief, or worse, pride. The house itself was her primary school. Within its smoke-darkened walls, she absorbed the expectations of her station. She watched her mother knead coarse dough on a wooden board, scrub rough wool in icy water, tend to her father's ailments with herb poultices she had learned from her own mother. These simple acts of care and survival were the foundation of her education. There were no letters to trace on wax tablets, no formal lessons, unless her family belonged to the rare stratum of wealth. Even among the privileged, instruction for daughters was often limited to just enough literacy to recite prayers or manage a household ledger. And so, from dawn until the last embers cooled in the hearth, she practiced her lessons in obedience and skill. She learned that her voice should be soft, her gaze lowered, her hands never idle. She learned to recognize the subtle signals of displeasure, a father's furrowed brow, a mother's weary sigh, and to adjust herself accordingly. She learned that her body was not yet her own, that it would one day belong to another, that this was neither cruel nor remarkable, but simply the way of things. Outside the cottage or manor, the village unfolded in its own relentless cycles. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, of sheep penned too close, and refuse tossed too near the threshold. Children played in the lanes when they could, but even their games mirrored the world of adults. Mock weddings, mock feasts, little girls swaddling rags as if they were infants. These performances were rehearsals for the real labors waiting in the near future. Some girls were spared the most grueling tasks, particularly those born to noble families. Yet privilege did not free them from the weight of expectation. In great halls lit by torches, they were taught to embroider fine linen, to pour wine gracefully, to walk with measured steps that conveyed decorum. Their mothers reminded them, gently or sharply, that their value lay in their modesty, their usefulness, and their unblemished reputation. A girl too quick with laughter or too slow to obey was a liability, a future wife of diminished worth. Occasionally there were stories, passed from mother to daughter, of women who had slipped the leash of custom and found their own way. A healer who knew the secrets of plants, a widow who managed her late husband's land, a noblewoman who had defended her castle while the men were away. But these tales were always shaded with caution. To step beyond the prescribed boundaries was to risk ruin or worse. Better, it was said, to keep one's ambitions folded small, like a letter hidden in the bodice. As she grew older, she began to see the quiet exhaustion etched in the faces around her, the stooped shoulders of women not yet 30, the raw hands that never fully healed. She listened as older girls whispered of the coming changes, blood that would mark her as ready for marriage, a readiness that no one asked her to define for herself. These transformations would not be occasions for celebration, but signals that her most narrow confinement was about to begin. Still, there were moments when the weight of her inheritance lifted, if only briefly. On a festival day, when the whole village gathered in rough merriment, she might glimpse another possibility in the bright banners fluttering over the churchyard. She might feel a flicker of desire to slip into the crowd and vanish, to walk past the edge of the fields and keep walking until no one knew her name. But such impulses were dangerous, she reminded herself. She must learn, as all women learned, to fold her longings neatly away. At dusk, she might sit by the threshold, watching the last light fade across the rooftops. The day's labor would leave her too tired for dreaming. Yet somewhere beneath the fatigue, a small voice continued to murmur that there must be more than this. She would hush it, the way her mother had hushed her cries as a baby, pressing that hope back into silence. And you may find yourself wondering, as you picture her there in the gathering dark, whether any of the women who came before her ever managed to answer that silent question, whether any of them discovered what waited on the far side of their allotted fate, the bargain of betrothal. When a girl crossed the invisible threshold between childhood and womanhood, she did not do so by her own design. There was no moment of clear consent, no chance to pause and consider whether she was ready to surrender what little freedom she possessed. Instead, the decision was made elsewhere, often in a quiet corner of the hall, where men with ink-stained fingers and fur-lined collars bent over parchment and sealed the contours of her life with a wax stamp. Betrothal in medieval Europe was not the tender storybook promise of affection it would later become in romantic literature. It was a transaction, an exchange of assets, alliances, and obligations. A girl's value was weighed in dowries, the acreage her father controlled, the debts her union might settle or create. While she learned to spin wool and tend goats, her marriage was already being arranged in hushed negotiations she would never be invited to join. It was common for the first discussions to begin long before she was thought of as a woman in any other sense. A child of 7 or 8 might already be spoken for, her future affixed to the name of a boy she had never met, or to a man whose hair had already silvered. The law might declare that the age of consent was 12, but the reality of betrothal was more ambiguous. Agreements could be formed earlier, only awaiting the girl's first menses to justify their consummation. If she was of noble birth, she might be sent away before she understood what it meant to leave. One morning, she would be bundled into a cart beside a nurse or a chaperone, her mother standing stiffly by the door with a face composed into dignified sorrow. The road ahead might lead to another castle, another cold hall, where she would be greeted not as a child, but as a future wife, an obligation clothed in silk. For daughters of humbler families, the transition could be less ceremonious, but no less irreversible. A girl might simply walk across the village square to the home of her new husband, the short distance between households transforming her from a daughter to a possession. Even then, She would be expected to bring something of worth. A chest of linens her mother had hoarded for years, perhaps a goat or a parcel of land, however small. This was the price of her passage. Her opinion, her wishes, her hopes, if she dared to hold any, counted for little. A daughter who protested too loudly could be beaten or shamed into submission. A girl who ran away would be dragged back. For the medieval mind, her resistance was not a question of conscience or maturity, but of disobedience, a failure to accept the role God and her father had chosen. And so, in the hush of her betrothal, she learned her first lessons in surrender. She would practice the posture of compliance, eyes lowered, hands folded over her skirts, her voice reduced to a murmur of assent. At the betrothal feast, if there was one, she would sit beside her intended, her body stiff with the effort of stillness, while the men toasted the union's promise. No one asked whether she understood the pledge she was making or whether she believed in it. Some chronicles tell of girls who trembled on these occasions, tears slipping down their cheeks despite their best efforts. Others adapted with a quiet resignation, already adept at the art of invisibility. A few, very few, found in their new household something that resembled kindness. But the rules of the bargain were always the same. She was to obey. She was to produce children. She was to keep the peace between two families that might otherwise have been rivals. In the months or years between betrothal and marriage, her training intensified. She learned to manage the stores of a household, to account for grain and salted meat, to spin linen fine enough to serve at her future table. Her mother or an older woman would instruct her in the subtle economies of wifely conduct, how to endure her husband's moods, how to keep the servants loyal, how to maintain appearances even in the face of private sorrow. Sometimes, as she bent over her needlework in the dim glow of a rushlight, she would feel a pang she could not quite name, a sense that the walls were already closing in, that her life had been spoken for before she had the words to argue. She might dare to imagine slipping away, running to a convent, perhaps, or disguising herself as a boy to vanish down the nearest road. But even these fantasies were treacherous. A girl who could not reconcile herself to her duty would be marked as unnatural, a threat to the fragile harmony of her family's ambitions. When at last the day came to leave behind the only home she had ever known, there were few ceremonies of farewell. Her mother might press a small token into her hand, a rosary, a lock of hair, as if to say that whatever happened next, she must remember who she had been. Her father might nod, or mutter a blessing, though his eyes were already turned to the business of the fields or the next negotiation. And so she stepped into the uncertain road ahead, her thoughts crowded with the expectations she must fulfill. Perhaps as the village receded behind her and the horizon widened, she felt a thin thread of hope that her new life might offer more than duty. But in her heart, she knew the truth. Her marriage was not a beginning she had chosen. It was a bargain she had been born to honor. And you may find yourself wondering, as you picture her riding beneath the broad sky of that medieval morning, whether she ever discovered a measure of freedom within the confines of her prescribed fate, or whether her dreams were destined to remain as hushed and hidden as the secrets she carried in her silent heart. The transformation into wife. When the day of marriage finally arrived, it did not unfold as a moment of romance or discovery. It was rather the formal completion of a transaction long in motion, a transaction that bound her to the man whose name she now shared, and to a future that had been chosen for her before she ever understood its terms. The ceremony itself was often a simple affair, especially for families of modest means. A priest would stand beneath the lintel of the church porch, or before the hearth in the great hall, offering prayers in Latin that many of those present could not understand. Witnesses gathered, neighbors, kinsmen, the occasional curious onlooker, more to affirm the contract's legitimacy than to celebrate any union of hearts. A ring was placed upon her finger, a token more symbolic of her husband's claim than of mutual devotion. In some villages, the bride's father would literally place her hand in the groom's, a final gesture of transfer that left no doubt as to whom she belonged. Afterward, there might be feasting if the families were prosperous enough. Tables laden with bread and cheese, perhaps a roasted pig if the harvest had been kind. Cups of ale or watered wine passed from hand to hand, while the bride sat silently at her husband's side, her stomach churning with dread and the pressure to appear composed. The guests spoke loudly over her bowed head, speculating about the number of sons she might bear, the management of the household she would inherit, the alliances that had been secured by her acquiescence. For some, the journey from marriage ceremony to the bridal chamber was the most humiliating of all. In noble circles, the bedding was a public ritual, overseen by family elders, who gathered to ensure that the marriage had been consummated. Curtains were drawn around the bed, but the laughter and the coarse jokes of the spectators penetrated the thin fabric. It was a ceremony at once prurient and practical, one that reduced her body to evidence, her private fear to communal spectacle. Once the morning came, the transformation was complete. She was no longer merely a daughter or a betrothed. She was a wife, bound to a husband whose authority over her was sanctioned by law, custom, and the teachings of the church. It was a role that encompassed every aspect of her existence, from the duties of the household to the demands of the marriage bed. To fail in any respect was to invite censure, gossip, or worse. In her new home, she would be greeted with the measured scrutiny reserved for a stranger. The older women, her husband's mother, aunts, or sisters, would watch her closely for signs of competence or weakness. Was she quick to rise in the morning? Could she manage the kitchen, the dairy, the small army of servants or laborers who looked to her for orders? Did she respect the hierarchy of her husband's kin, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent? Every gesture was appraised, every error catalogued. Even in the wealthiest households, the role of wife was no gentle Edel. Her responsibilities were unrelenting. She must oversee the stores, tallying grain, preserving salted meats, ensuring that nothing went to waste in the lean months of winter. She must direct the spinning and weaving of cloth, the brewing of ale, the mending of garments. If her husband traveled, she must act in his stead, collecting rents or settling disputes among the tenants. If he returned displeased, she must anticipate the mood that shadowed him and absorb his frustrations without complaint. And always, threaded through every day and every duty, was the expectation of fertility. A wife who bore sons secured her place and her safety. A wife who produced only daughters, or no children at all, lived under a cloud of disappointment that darkened her marriage and her standing in the household. In the privacy of her chamber, she might weep over each loss or each barren year, but in public, she was expected to maintain a composed, untroubled face. Occasionally, she might catch a glimpse of her own youth in a polished copper basin or the mirrored surface of a well. The reflection would startle her, a face pale with fatigue, hair concealed beneath a wimple or veil, the lines of care already forming around her eyes. The girl who had once dared to wonder what freedom felt like seemed very far away, replaced by a woman who measured her worth in duties performed and expectations met. Yet not all moments were grim. In the quiet before dawn, as she prepared the household for the day, she might feel a slender current of pride. The bread she baked sustained the bodies of those around her, The cloth she spun kept them warm. The children she bore, if she was fortunate, curled against her side at night, their small hands seeking reassurance in her presence. These were her modest triumphs, achievements that would go unrecorded in any chronicle, but which lent a measure of dignity to the life she had not chosen. And in rare hours of solitude, when the hearth fire burned low and the world outside was hushed, she might allow herself a fragile hope that perhaps, in time, she would discover something like affection in her husband's eyes, that perhaps her daughters would inherit a gentler future, that perhaps her story, so often silent, so easily overlooked, contained its own quiet significance. You might wonder, as you picture her there in the glow of that wavering flame, whether she ever allowed herself to imagine an existence beyond the limits set for her, whether in her private thoughts she still believed that she was more than the sum of her obligations and her lineage, the quiet tyranny of domestic life. In the months that followed her wedding, the reality of her new existence settled over her like a dense and constant fog. There was no single moment when she could say her transformation was complete. It unfolded in increments, so slowly she barely noticed the surrender of her old self to the routines that came to define her. The medieval household was its own small kingdom, and she was expected to govern it with diligence and submission in equal measure. From dawn's first glimmer through the long, hushed hours after sunset, her life was a procession of chores so familiar they became nearly invisible. The floors to be swept, the kettles to be scoured, the loaves to be kneaded and placed near the embers to rise. These tasks were so constant, so absolute, that they became the architecture of her days, a framework more binding than any lock or chain. In wealthier households, she might have had servants to direct, young girls or older women whose labor mirrored her own. But delegation did not lessen the burden. If anything, it added new anxieties. Were the stores accounted for properly? Were the linen chests secure from damp? Had the sheep been driven to the right pasture? Every oversight, every error was a mark against her competence, an invitation for gossip to wind its sly way through the halls. When she was young, she may have pictured herself presiding over these matters with quiet grace, like the matrons of legend, whose virtue was praised in the sermons she once heard at the parish church. But in truth, domestic life was rarely graceful. It was exhausting and repetitive. The rhythms of the household left little space for reflection or rest. The dawn began with the rekindling of the hearth, a task she often performed herself, if the servants were slow or the night had been particularly cold. She would crouch in her heavy gown, coaxing embers to life with careful breath and handfuls of straw. Even in summer, the air at that hour was cool enough to chill her bones, and she learned to tuck her hands into her sleeves to ward off the ache in her knuckles. By the time the men roused themselves from their beds, she had been awake for hours. The first meal prepared and set upon the table, the children washed and dressed, the kitchen already in motion. Few remarked on her labors. They were as expected and unremarkable as the turning of the seasons. The bulk of her day passed in a sequence of attentions, measuring grain into sacks for the steward to distribute, weighing herbs in the stillroom, counting eggs, spinning wool. Even these tasks were not her own to order. The priorities shifted according to her husband's needs, the demands of guests, the cycles of planting and harvest. Though she was told that the household was her domain, she knew it was only so long as her governance pleased the men who held real authority. Should she fall ill or falter, there was little sympathy. A wife was not permitted weakness. If her health suffered after childbirth, she was expected to resume her duties as soon as she could stand. If her mind grew dull with exhaustion, she must never show it. The household relied upon her invisibility, her quiet, uncomplaining endurance. Still, there were small, hidden consolations. She found them in the delicate satisfaction of a well-risen loaf, in the sheen of clean linen folded into neat stacks. In the evenings, as she stitched by candlelight, she could almost forget the quiet tyranny of her days. The sound of her needle sliding through cloth was a gentle rhythm that belonged to her alone. Sometimes, in that hush, her thoughts turned to the life she might have led if she had been born to different circumstances. A life of learning, perhaps. She had once watched her brothers recite their Latin lessons and felt a fierce, inexplicable longing to join them. Or a life free from the strictures of marriage, like the nuns who vanished behind convent walls and never emerged again. But such thoughts were dangerous indulgences. They left her restless and unsatisfied, and so she learned to push them aside. Her children, when they came, were both her burden and her comfort. She studied their faces for glimpses of her own spirit, some spark of curiosity or defiance she could recognize and cherish. But even motherhood was not hers to define. Her daughters were to be prepared for the same fate she had endured, her sons to be raised with the knowledge that they would one day command. On feast days, or in the rare leisure of a winter afternoon, she might sit with the other women of the household. They shared quiet jokes and stories, fragments of memory that passed between them like a secret language. For a little while, the walls of her world seemed softer, more permeable. She would look around the circle and see not merely wives or servants, but companions in a common trial. And when the day ended at last, when the house fell silent and the candles burned low, she would feel something like relief. She had survived another day without failure or scandal. Tomorrow would bring the same duties, the same constraints. But tonight, in the fleeting hush before sleep, she could claim a single private victory, the knowledge that she had done all that was required of her, and perhaps a little more. And you might find yourself wondering, as you picture her in that small, dark chamber, how she managed to sustain herself through the endless repetition, how she learned to find dignity in the quiet tyranny of domestic life without ever quite surrendering the memory of her own hidden, unspoken dreams. The relentless cycle of childbirth. Among all the labors she undertook, none carried such profound consequence or such constant dread as the duty to bear children. From the first moment her marriage was sealed, the expectation began to hover over her like a silent directive. It was never discussed openly in her presence. There was no need. Everyone understood that a wife's primary purpose was to secure the lineage, to populate the household with sons who would one day inherit their father's land and name. If she was fortunate, conception came swiftly, sparing her the anxious whispers and sidelong glances that greeted each empty month. But the blessing of pregnancy arrived entangled with fear. There was no science to guide her, no reliable midwife in every village. Knowledge of how to sustain herself and the life within her came in fragments. Old wives' recipes for strengthening the womb, whispered cautions about lifting a heavy pail or stepping across a threshold the wrong way. In the earliest weeks, she did not announce her condition. Superstition counseled secrecy, for too much attention invited misfortune. Instead, she carried her secret with a wary hope, feeling each small discomfort as a confirmation of what she dared not yet declare. Her body belonged to her husband by law and to her unborn child by necessity, and her own needs receded into the background. As the months wore on, her daily tasks became heavier. Even as her belly swelled, there was no suspension of her obligations. She rose to tend the hearth, to manage the household accounts, to oversee the dairy. Only when her strength failed entirely might she retreat to her bed. And even then, she was not free from scrutiny. A frail or idle wife was regarded with suspicion. She was expected to endure as her mother had, and her grandmother before her. When the hour of labor arrived, it often began without ceremony. Only a tightening in her back, a slow gathering of pain that would not release its grip. In that moment, the household closed around her. The men withdrew to distant corners, while the older women and the midwife took command. They prepared the birthing stool, laid cloths across the floor, and stoked the fire higher to warm the chamber. In this moment of crisis, a woman became a creature apart, subject to forces no one fully understood. The midwife murmured prayers and pressed amulets into her palms. She whispered instructions in the patient, unhurried tone of one who had seen many such ordeals. Yet no matter how many births the midwife had witnessed, each was its own small crucible of terror and hope. There was no predictability in childbirth. For some, the process was swift and uncomplicated. For others, it stretched across unending hours or even days of agony. A child lodged in the birth canal, a fever that took hold with pitiless speed, a hemorrhage no herb could staunch. Any of these could end the story before it had truly begun. And while her pain was hers alone, her outcome belonged to everyone. A live, healthy infant brought relief and celebration. A stillbirth or the death of the mother cast a shadow over the household that could linger for years. In a world that prized continuity above all, a woman's survival was secondary to her ability to produce heirs. If she emerged from her confinement alive, there was little time to recover. The church required her to be churched, a purification rite to cleanse her of the perceived impurity of childbirth before she could resume her place in the community. And so, within days or weeks, she was once more overseeing the scullery, the spinning room, the kitchen. Her infant swaddled in a cradle by the hearth, her body still aching with wounds that would never fully mend. For some women, these cycles repeated without pause. The body, weakened by one pregnancy, was scarcely allowed to heal before the next began. It was not uncommon for a woman to bear 10 or 12 children over her lifetime. Not all survived infancy, and each loss left its own quiet scar. A grief that was expected to remain private, folded into her composure like another layer of her heavy garments. And when the years of childbearing finally came to an end, whether by age, by illness, or by sheer physical depletion, she did not always feel relief. For in a culture that measured her value by fertility, a woman who could no longer conceive was subtly diminished in the eyes of those around her. Her usefulness had been exhausted, her identity transformed yet again. From bride to wife to mother to something more ambiguous, a matron whose presence inspired neither curiosity nor admiration. Yet within this relentless cycle, there were moments of something like grace. When she held a newborn against her breast, she might feel a fragile triumph that no one could take from her. In that quiet, drowsy hour, as the infant's small mouth sought her warmth, she could almost believe that her suffering had purpose, that her life was more than the sum of its trials. And you may wonder, picturing her in that dim chamber, what she thought in the silent intervals between her labors, whether she permitted herself to imagine that, in some gentler world beyond her own, a woman might be cherished, not merely for the children she could bring forth, but for the unremarkable, unrecorded courage that carried her through each birth, each loss, and each new beginning. The shadow of disease and famine. Across the long centuries of the Middle Ages, disease was never far away. It crept along the narrow lanes between cottages, settled in the straw pallets where entire families lay crowded together, and drifted unseen on the breath of travelers passing through the market square. A medieval woman carried this awareness within her like an unspoken prayer. The knowledge that no matter how carefully she tended her household, No matter how clean she kept the rushes on the floor or how faithfully she boiled her family's water, sickness could arrive at any hour. Illness came in many forms. Fevers that left the sufferer delirious, coughs that deepened to a rattling in the lungs, infections that turned a small cut into a life-threatening wound. Children were particularly vulnerable, their bodies thin and undernourished in times of scarcity. It was not uncommon for a mother to bury more than one child before she herself reached middle age. Grief was a constant undercurrent in her life, never allowed to break the surface for long. Famine, too, was a visitor that returned with grim regularity. A cold spring could blight the fields, or an unexpected flood could wash away the tender shoots of barley and rye. Grain stores ran low, then empty, while the price of bread rose beyond the reach of even modest households. In those hungry months, a woman's ingenuity was tested to its limits. She learned to stretch every handful of dried peas, to boil weeds and roots into thin broths, to pretend that her own hollow belly was of no consequence so long as her children ate. Her responsibilities multiplied in crisis. When a sickness took hold in the village, she became nurse as well as housekeeper. She rose before dawn to tend the ill, sponging their foreheads with vinegar, murmuring the few prayers she had committed to memory. And when her own strength began to falter, she concealed it behind her tasks, unwilling to show fear or weakness that might burden others. In the narrow world of the medieval household, remedies were passed down like precious heirlooms. A woman learned them not in any school, but from the hands of her mother and grandmother. A poultice of mustard seed for a congested chest, a syrup of honey and garlic to soothe a cough, a sprig of rue tied around the neck to ward off contagion. No one expected these cures to be certain, but they were better than doing nothing. Yet in times of plague, nothing could protect her. The Black Death arrived in Europe like an invisible tide, and it spared no class or household. When the pestilence swept through her village, she would have heard the bells tolling without pause, would have smelled the smoke of hastily built pyres. She may have carried her own children to the churchyard, wrapping them in what linen she could spare, and returned to a home so silent it no longer felt real. The fear was not only for herself and her kin. Famine and disease disrupted the fragile order of medieval society. When hunger became too sharp, or death too common, people questioned the justice of God and the authority of those who claimed to speak for him. A woman was taught from childhood to submit to these calamities as tests of faith. Yet in the private recesses of her thoughts, she surely wondered why heaven's trials must fall so heavily on the innocent. Despite this, she endured. In the aftermath of each epidemic, she gathered what remained, repaired the thatch on the roof, scrubbed the walls with lye, sowed what seeds she could afford. When the next harvest came, however meager, she gave thanks simply for its existence. Gratitude was not always a matter of abundance. Sometimes it was only the thin comfort of surviving when so many had not. Through it all, her life was measured in small victories. A child's fever breaking at last, a ration of barley lasting longer than she dared hope, a day when every member of her household rose from bed without complaint. These moments were never recorded in the chronicles that celebrated kings and conquests, yet they formed the quiet backbone of medieval history. And perhaps, when you imagine her sitting by her hearth, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, you might sense the weight she bore, the certainty that each season would bring fresh hazards, the understanding that her role was to persist in the face of them, to hold her family together with her own exhausted hands. You might wonder how she found the strength to hope again each spring, even when the memory of hunger and sickness lay just behind her, waiting to return. The silent bargain of marriage. In the dim halls of memory, there was always a wedding. some ceremony she had attended as a girl, where the bride's face was hidden by a heavy veil and her hands trembled when she reached for her husband's. It was then she first understood that marriage was never only a union of two souls. It was a contract, a transaction, a quiet bargain struck between families who measured a woman's worth in coin, land, and the promise of heirs. When her own wedding day arrived, she entered into that bargain without illusions. She had been prepared for this all her life, her dowry negotiated in hushed conversations, her obedience rehearsed in every small act of deference she performed for her father. No one asked if she wished to marry. That question was as irrelevant as whether the grain wished to be harvested. From the moment the vows were spoken, her identity shifted. She ceased to belong to the house where she was born and became the property of another. Her husband's name became her own. His fortunes, whether generous or meager, determined her comfort, her safety, and her standing in the eyes of neighbors. The medieval world offered few alternatives. To refuse marriage was to risk the stigma of spinsterhood, a status that rendered a woman suspect and vulnerable. A wife, however restricted her freedom, had the protection of her husband's household and the legitimacy it conferred. And so she accepted her new role, believing, because she must, that she would find some measure of peace within it. On good days, there was a kind of companionship in her marriage. She and her husband shared the same roof, the same table, the same daily concerns. She might watch him work the fields or oversee the accounts of the manor and feel an unexpected fondness, a recognition that they were bound together by necessity as much as by sentiment. But affection did not erase the fundamental imbalance between them. In all matters, his authority was final. He could direct the course of her days, decide the fate of her children, even discipline her body if he deemed it necessary. These rights were not exceptional. They were the natural prerogatives of a husband, sanctioned by law and custom alike. When disputes arose, and they always did in any household, she learned the delicate art of conciliation. A sharp word could escalate to a reprimand. A moment of defiance could be cited as evidence of disobedience. The boundaries of her freedom were invisible, but absolute. She learned to move within them carefully, to maintain her dignity without inviting reproach. There were nights when she lay awake beside him, staring into the darkness, and wondered if any woman before her had ever felt truly content in marriage. She recalled the stories of noble women wed to aging kings for the sake of alliance, or of peasant girls married off to strangers twice their age in exchange for a parcel of land. No one spoke of what those women felt when they set aside their girlhood and assumed the mantle of wifehood, but she suspected their hearts were not so different from her own. And yet, marriage was not only a prison, it was also a crucible, a place where she discovered the edges of her own resilience. She learned to navigate her husband's moods, to counsel him when he was troubled, to steady the household when he was absent or ill. Over time, these efforts became their own quiet source of strength. In the rare hours when she and her husband found themselves alone, without the press of duties or the scrutiny of kin, they sometimes spoke as equals. He might recount a memory from his boyhood, and she would feel a flicker of recognition, as though she glimpsed the child he had once been. She would tell him of her own childhood, of the orchard where she used to steal apples, the stream she waded barefoot in the first warm days of spring. In those moments, she saw him not as a master, but simply as another soul, enduring the same uncertain world. But such moments were fragile. They could not alter the deeper currents that shaped their lives. No matter how tender their conversation, the truth remained. She had entered this union because it was expected of her, and her role within it was defined by obligations she had never chosen. Still, she found ways to claim small territories of agency. She oversaw the management of their stores, negotiated with the reeve, and advised her husband on the best use of their resources. In these domains, her counsel was valued, even if it could never outweigh his judgment. In time, she grew to understand that marriage was not a single event, but an unending series of negotiations, some spoken aloud, many conducted in silence. Each day, she measured what she could accept and what she must quietly resist. Each day, she weighed her own will against the expectations that pressed upon her from every side. And perhaps you too can imagine her there in the hush of her chamber, the glow of the embers soft on her face, wondering whether it was possible to love and submit at the same time, wondering if she had ever truly belonged to herself at all. The invisible labor of the household, each dawn, before the first cockerel's call stirred the village to life, she was already awake. Her hands moved by memory alone, gathering the tinder, coaxing a fragile flame from the embers left banked overnight. The hush of these earliest hours was her only solitude. While her husband and children still slept, she could pause a moment to feel her own breath, to remember that she was more than the sum of her tasks. But soon enough, the day would demand her entirely. In medieval Europe, a woman's work was as constant as the turning of the seasons. Endless, repetitive, invisible. It was her labor that underpinned the household, her diligence that kept hunger and squalor at bay. Yet rarely did anyone remark upon it, for this was simply what a wife and mother did. The hearth was her domain, and from its modest heat, she conjured all the nourishment her family would know. Before the sun rose high enough to warm the eaves, she had already prepared the morning meal, porridge thickened with a scrap of lard, perhaps a crust of coarse bread to be shared among many. She measured each portion carefully, knowing that every crumb wasted now might mean an empty belly later. When the meal was done, she turned to the other duties that filled her hours. There was always mending, a tear in her husband's tunic from the scythe, a frayed hem on her child's only gown. She sat near the small window for light, her needle threading in and out of the fabric, her thoughts drifting to matters she dared not voice. The dwindling stores of grain, the rumors of sickness in the next village, the long winter yet to come. Laundry was an ordeal that could not be postponed. She hauled heavy tubs of water from the well or stream, her back already aching from countless such journeys. The linens were scrubbed with lye soap so harsh it cracked the skin of her hands. As she wrung them out and spread them on the hedges to dry, she watched the steam rise into the morning chill and allowed herself a single, silent sigh. The smallest children clung to her skirts as she worked. She hushed their cries with the same practiced patience she used to soothe her husband's temper. She knew the patterns of each face, the way her youngest's eyes brightened at a scrap of cheese, how her eldest's voice took on an edge when hunger gnawed too long. She carried these details inside her like a private litany. In the growing season, her labor extended beyond the threshold. She tended the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from the beds of leeks and cabbages, coaxing life from soil so thin it could scarcely sustain them. She knew which herbs eased fever and which might quiet a cough. She gathered them in bundles, drying them in the loft to keep against the season when illness came to call. If her household kept animals, a sow in the sty, a clutch of hens scratching in the yard, their care fell to her as well. She collected eggs, churned butter, salted meat for the lean months ahead. Each task demanded time and vigilance. A fox in the night, a sudden frost, a slip of her attention could undo weeks of effort, and all the while her mind remained vigilant to their words. A husband's moodiness after a sore harvest, an elder's failing strength, a neighbor's quiet plea for help. These too were part of her domain. She mediated quarrels, lent spare provisions when she could, offered comfort without expectation of return. The boundaries of her care reached far beyond the walls of her home. In wealthier households, A lady of the manor supervised the work rather than performing each duty herself. Yet even she was not idle. She oversaw the accounts, ensured the servants kept to their tasks, and dispensed alms to the destitute who gathered at her gates. She was expected to maintain a calm, gracious demeanor, no matter the private trials she endured. Respectability demanded it. Regardless of her station, a medieval woman's days left little space for reflection. And so she learned to find her moments of quiet within the flow of labor, the hush that descended when all were fed, the hush before the candle was extinguished at night. In those fleeting instants, she might allow herself to remember the girl she had once been, the girl who had imagined that adulthood held some secret freedom, some unspoken promise. But dawn always returned, and with it the familiar procession of tasks. She rose again without complaint, because to do otherwise was unthinkable. The rhythm of her labor was the heartbeat of her family's survival, and you may find yourself picturing her now, bent over her work, the flicker of the hearth catching in her hair. Perhaps you can sense how her spirit persisted, quiet but unbroken, in a world that never ceased to ask more of her. You might wonder if she ever dared to dream of a life beyond the walls she scrubbed, the fields she tended. If she believed that, somewhere beyond the horizon, a woman's worth might be measured by something more than the constancy of her toil. The perilous path of motherhood. In the quiet hours of the night, when the embers of the hearth burned low and the household finally surrendered to sleep, her thoughts often returned to the same unspoken dread. For a medieval woman, motherhood was a duty as inevitable as it was perilous. It shaped her life more profoundly than any other bond or obligation. No matter how many times she had braved childbirth, no matter how often she had nursed a child through fever, the fear never left her. From the moment she was old enough to bleed, she understood that her worth would be measured by the children she bore, especially the sons. An empty cradle was a silent reproach, a sign of failure she carried in her own flesh. Each successful birth was a fragile triumph. Each miscarriage or stillbirth was a sorrow born largely alone. Pregnancy itself was both a blessing and a threat. With every swelling belly came the hope of a healthy heir and the knowledge that her own life hung in the balance. In a world without antiseptics, without skilled physicians readily at hand, even the simplest labor could spiral into a struggle she might not survive. In the weeks before her time came, she prepared as best she could. She gathered herbs, motherwort, mugwort, pennyroyal, whose virtues had been whispered down through generations. She mended the linens she would clutch in pain. She asked her neighbors and kin to pray for her safe delivery, though she knew their prayers were no guarantee. When the first pains began, she was not alone. The women of her household assembled in the birthing chamber, her mother, if she still lived, her sisters, the village midwife who had seen countless labors. The midwife brought knowledge as old as memory itself, a mixture of folk wisdom and practical skill. She knew how to ease a laboring woman's breath with murmured reassurance, how to coax a breech child into the correct position, how to staunch bleeding when everything went wrong. Yet even this communal support could not remove the danger. For some women, labor stretched on for days, their strength ebbing hour by hour. Others succumbed quickly to hemorrhage or infection. The surviving family mourned them with the grim acceptance that such losses were part of life. If the baby survived but the mother did not, her body was laid out in the same chamber where she had delivered her child. The newborn was often passed to another woman to nurse, the living and the dead occupying the same small room for a time. Those who survived the ordeal emerged transformed. Their bodies bore the scars, torn muscles, damaged pelvic bones, prolapsed wombs. Many never fully recovered their strength. And yet, When the first weeks of bleeding had passed, they were expected to resume their labors. The fields, the hearth, and the children already born could not wait. For the noblewoman, the stakes were no less severe. A queen's fertility was a matter of dynastic survival, her body a vessel to secure alliances and strengthen claims. Queens like Eleanor of Castile endured pregnancy after pregnancy, compelled by duty and expectation. Eleanor, married to Edward IV of England, conceived at least 16 times. The cost to her health can only be imagined. Even so, the loss of children was no less frequent among the elite than among the peasantry. Royal infants died in their cradles as often as common ones. The birth of a son might be celebrated with feasting and gifts, while the arrival of a daughter was met with more subdued relief. A girl could still marry well and serve the family's ambitions, but she would never carry the line forward in her own name. A mother knew, in some unspoken part of her heart, that every daughter she bore would inherit her same narrow prospects. Once the child was safely delivered, the work began anew. She must keep it warm and fed, must guard it from infection. She must rouse herself in the dead of night to nurse the baby's hunger or soothe its cries. There were no guarantees. The records of medieval life are filled with the briefest entries, names and dates marking infants who lived only a few days or weeks. In wealthier homes, a wet nurse might be employed, freeing the mother to recover her strength or fulfill her other obligations. Yet this, too, brought risk. Children fostered away could sicken without warning or fail to bond with the mother who birthed them. Some women refused such arrangements, believing it was their sacred duty to feed their own offspring, no matter the cost to their health. Motherhood did not end with infancy. As her children grew, she became the one to instruct them in their earliest lessons: how to recite prayers, how to keep their hands busy at small tasks, how to behave in the presence of elders. She corrected them gently or firmly, depending on the child's nature. And always, she braced herself against the knowledge that the world beyond the threshold held perils she could never fully guard them from. Disease, accident, and hunger could claim the young as easily as the old. A mother learned not to take any moment for granted. Each year a child survived was a quiet cause for thanksgiving. Every new milestone, walking, speaking, helping with chores, felt precious. A small victory in an existence defined by uncertainty. And when she laid her head down at night, weary beyond words, she carried the same unspoken hope that tomorrow her children would wake beside her, that tomorrow she would have the strength to do it all again. Perhaps you can see her now in the darkened chamber, her newborn wrapped against her chest, her thoughts drifting between exhaustion and fierce resolve. You might wonder what courage it took to greet each dawn, knowing how fragile every life under her care truly was. The weight of expectation. From the first moment she could understand the words spoken around her, she knew there were expectations that would follow her all her life. They began in the cradle, when her mother measured her small limbs and wondered whether she would grow strong enough to bear many children. They continued in the murmured hopes of her father, hopes that she would one day bring a good dowry, that she would marry well, and not bring shame upon the family's name. Expectation was not something she could set aside or escape. It clung to her as persistently as the dust on her skirts. In the Middle Ages, a woman's value was rarely measured by her intelligence or her ambitions. Instead, it was counted in the tally of her virtues, her modesty, her obedience, her quiet industry. Before she was old enough to fully comprehend her own place in the world, she was instructed in all the ways she must guard her reputation. The admonitions were woven into her daily life. A girl must keep her eyes lowered, her voice soft. She must never be seen alone with a man who was not her kin. She must dress with care, covering her hair and her limbs, so that no suggestion of vanity or wantonness could be read in her appearance. Even in the poorest cottage, a mother watched her daughter's conduct as vigilantly as she watched the pot on the hearth. A single misstep, a flirtatious glance, an unguarded smile could seed gossip that would grow beyond any hope of pruning. And once a girl's virtue was questioned, it was rarely restored. In wealthier households, the constraints were no less severe, though they came clothed in finer fabrics. A noblewoman might have embroidered gowns and polished slippers, but her path was no freer. She was trained from infancy to move gracefully, to entertain guests without appearing too bold, to conceal any opinions that might suggest she was overstepping her station. Her education, if she received any formal instruction, emphasized religious devotion and household management. She might learn to read a psalter, to recite Latin prayers, or to keep the accounts of a manor. But the lessons stopped short of encouraging independent thought. An educated woman was regarded with unease, a creature who risked bringing disruption to the natural order. As she reached marriageable age, the expectations shifted, but did not lessen. Now she became the subject of negotiations. Her family considered which union might improve their fortunes or secure their lands. She herself was consulted only as a formality. Even her willingness was an afterthought. When her betrothal was announced, she was praised for her docility, her beauty, her promise as a wife. In hushed conversations, older women spoke of the challenges that lay ahead, how she must prepare herself to please her husband, how she must guard her household's honor as fiercely as any knight protected a castle's walls. And when the wedding came, she was handed from her father's authority to her husband's, the transfer as final as any property transaction. Her dowry was tallied, her value appraised. In the eyes of the law and the church, she became an appendage of her husband's estate, bound to him in duty and in submission. Once she entered her new home, the weight of expectation did not lift. If she bore a son quickly, she was praised as a blessing to her line. If she miscarried or bore daughters, her worth was quietly questioned, as though her womb alone defined her character. She learned to measure her own success by the health of her children, the neatness of her household, the contentment of her husband. To fail in any of these was to risk condemnation, a scolded wife, a barren mother. These were identities as fixed as any name, and still, she was expected to bear this weight without complaint. Silence was a virtue, a shield against accusation. No matter how heavy her burdens, she was to carry them with a bowed head and a steady hand. It is tempting to look back from our own time and wonder how she managed, how she rose each day to face the same constraints, the same narrow definitions of worth. Perhaps she found solace in her faith, in the stories of saintly women who endured even harsher trials with patient grace. Perhaps she found comfort in small defiance, a moment alone by the well, a secret smile shared with a trusted friend, a thought she never spoke aloud but held close to her heart. Expectation was a lattice that shaped her every choice, but within it, she learned to survive. She learned to gather her strength from sources no one else could see, from the memory of her mother's counsel, from the quiet pride she took in her skill, from the knowledge that though unseen, her labor sustained the world around her. And when the candle was finally snuffed at the end of the day, she lay in the darkness with her hands folded over her chest, her mind sifting through all she had done, all she had failed to do. In that hush, she might dare to imagine another life, a life in which she was measured not by her compliance, but by the fullness of her spirit. You may find yourself picturing her there, her face turned to the shadows, her breath slow with exhaustion. Perhaps you wonder what dreams stirred behind her closed eyes, whether she ever glimpsed, even for an instant, a world that asked nothing of her, but to simply exist as she was. The silent burden of reputation. In the hush of the village night, when even the dogs ceased their restless barking, a woman lay awake beneath her thatched roof, her thoughts circling the same worry that had shadowed her since girlhood. Her reputation was not merely her own. It was the fragile vessel that carried her family's standing, her children's prospects, and the respect she was afforded in every encounter. Among medieval women, reputation was a currency as potent as any coin. It was earned not through great deeds or learned words, but through a lifetime of careful restraint. A woman's good name depended on her silence, her modesty, and her capacity to bear insult without protest. Even the smallest transgressions could ignite suspicion. A young wife glimpsed walking alone along the hedgerow might inspire whispers. A widow who refused to remarry could be marked as unnatural. An older woman with knowledge of healing herbs, especially if she lived apart or carried herself with too much confidence, might find her neighbors glancing away when she passed. These judgments did not arrive with the force of law, but they were no less binding. Gossip was a slow, steady erosion, wearing away a woman's standing until she found herself isolated. And once the rot had set in, it was nearly impossible to scrub away. She knew this, as all women did. It was why she chose her words so mercifully when speaking to the priest or the reeve. Why she kept her gaze lowered when men gathered in the marketplace. Why she accepted the sharp corrections of her husband, her father, or her elder brother without visible resentment. Reputation shaped every hour of her life. It influenced where she was permitted to go, whom she could befriend, how she was greeted in the churchyard. It was an invisible wall, confining her movements and defining her worth. Among noble families, reputation could be a matter of inheritance as much as of conduct. A family tarnished by scandal, an adulterous mother, a disobedient daughter might see marriage prospects vanish, dowries disputed, alliances dissolve. A noblewoman thus became not only the keeper of her own virtue, but the guardian of her lineage's future. A queen like Isabeau of Bavaria knew this burden more keenly than most. As wife to a king whose mind often teetered on the edge of madness, she faced scrutiny from every corner of the court. Each gesture she made, each alliance she considered, was weighed for signs of impropriety. Rumor had a peculiar appetite for powerful women, and no amount of piety or diplomacy could fully satisfy it. Far below the glittering courts, in the cottages where women spun flax by candlelight, the same peril loomed. A single accusation of infidelity, of witchcraft, of being overbold, could see a woman dragged before the manorial court. She might be fined, whipped, or forced to stand in public penance, her hair shorn, her body exposed to the jeers of her neighbors. No evidence was too meager. A dried sprig of rue tucked in her apron, a basin of water left to stand overnight, a word spoken in anger that was remembered and repeated with a twist. And yet, even in the face of such risks, a woman's reputation was not wholly in her keeping. A jealous rival, a spurned suitor, or an ill-tempered husband might see her name stained beyond repair. The church taught that a woman's virtue was her most precious possession, but it failed to admit how easily others could strip it away. To protect herself, she learned the art of constant vigilance. She taught her daughters to keep their heads down, to avoid idle chatter, to offer no fuel to the ever-hungry flames of gossip. If a neighbor hinted at scandal, she deflected with polite indifference. If a stranger's eyes lingered too long, she tightened her shawl and turned away. Yet none of these precautions offered certainty. Even the most modest woman could find herself accused if misfortune fell upon the village. A cow gone dry, a child stricken with fever. A scapegoat was always needed, and often it was the woman whose quiet dignity set her apart. You might imagine her now, sitting in the dim corner of her cottage, her hands folded in her lap as she listens to the muted voices outside. She cannot hear the words clearly, but she knows the cadence of suspicion when it falls into a hush. She feels it in her chest, that tight coil of fear and resignation. Reputation was both shield and shackle. It protected her so long as she remained within its narrow bounds, but it offered no defense if others decided she had strayed. The knowledge of this was a silent burden she carried everywhere, as constant as her own heartbeat. Perhaps in that darkness, she allowed herself a single, unspoken wish, that she could live even one day without the weight of so many watchful eyes, measuring every step she took. One day to move through the world, unjudged and unafraid. And then, as dawn crept across the thatch, she gathered her resolve once more, for there was no other choice but to endure. The cost of childhood lost. If you picture a medieval village in the hush of dawn, you might imagine the smallest children still bundled in rough blankets, their breath misting the air as they slept. But childhood in this world was a season so brief it scarcely deserved the name. A girl had only a handful of years before her life was weighed against the needs of her family and the expectations of her station. From infancy, her path was marked by the quiet calculation of her elders, how many hands the household required to survive, what alliances might be made through her marriage, whether she would grow strong enough to carry future generations. The word childhood did not mean a time of carefree play, as we understand it now. It was simply an interval before she was deemed useful. By the age of 5 or 6, she was expected to shoulder small labors. Perhaps she followed her mother into the fields to glean what grain the harvesters had left behind. Perhaps she tended the goats, her small hands learning to braid their tethers. In wealthier homes, she might be taught the first stitches of embroidery, her fingers pricked and raw as she tried to master neat rows. There was no question of whether she was ready. The village's survival left little room for sentiment. She learned by observing, by failing, by trying again until the work became as natural as breathing. By 7 or 8, a girl's duties expanded. She helped keep the fire alive in the hearth, swept the beaten earth floor, fetched water from the stream. Each day she watched the older women, noting how they measured flour, mended tears in linen, comforted a fretful baby. These were the skills she must soon possess, for no one would spare time to teach her when her own household needed tending. Some girls, daughters of knights or prosperous merchants, were sent away to fosterage in other households. There, among strangers, they were expected to learn refinement, the right way to curtsy, the proper words to greet a noble guest, the delicate arts of courtesy that would one day secure a husband's regard. The strangeness of this uprooting was seldom acknowledged. A child who wept for her mother's arms learned quickly to keep her sorrow hidden. By 12, a girl might already be spoken for. Betrothal was not a matter of her own inclinations. It was an arrangement between fathers, sometimes brokered before she was old enough to understand its purpose. The moment her body began to show signs of maturity, her future as a wife and mother loomed near. Her first bleeding was met with solemn attention. Among her female kin, it was both a rite of passage and a silent warning. Soon, she would leave this household for another. Soon, she would be expected to bear children of her own. However she might feel about it, her readiness was irrelevant. And so the brief, liminal time between girlhood and womanhood was threaded with a quiet dread. Perhaps she still found moments of laughter, gossip shared over the laundry vat, a game played on a stolen afternoon. But each passing season closed the window of her youth a little further. In the castle halls, noble girls were scarcely freer. Their lessons were more polished: music, heraldry, the finer points of estate management. but their destinies were no less determined by others. A noble daughter was a token in the great game of alliances. She knew it in every measured glance her father cast her way, in every veiled remark about her appearance, her manners, her readiness to wed. To look back now is to feel the ache of something irretrievable, a time of innocence, too often cut short by necessity and custom. Yet for the girl herself, there was rarely space to imagine life could be otherwise. She saw no examples of women whose lives belonged to themselves. She could not picture a future shaped by her own choosing. When we speak of the hardships of medieval women, we often think first of marriage, childbirth, or drudgery. But perhaps the first and most poignant loss was this: the loss of a true childhood, a time to play without purpose, to grow without fear, to wonder without shame. Instead, she learned to measure her worth by her usefulness, to guard her conduct before she fully understood why, to steel herself against the changes that would come before she had found her own voice. You might imagine her at twilight, when her chores were momentarily done, sitting on the threshold with her knees pulled to her chest. For a few minutes, she was only a child again, watching the bats wheel above the thatch. She might allow herself a fleeting hope, of freedom, of softness, of time, but the evening bell would toll, summoning her inside, and the small secret dream would be folded away with the rest of her girlhood, tucked in the quiet corners of her heart, where no one could see how dearly she wished it might last. The shadow of the hearth, in the quiet gloom of an early morning, when the fire was nothing but a bed of cooling embers, a woman might sit in the half-light and feel the walls closing in around her. This was the domain she was expected to govern: her hearth, her household, her small kingdom of chores and obligations. Yet this dominion was a narrow one, offering little in the way of solace or freedom. The hearth was the center of life, both literally and symbolically. It was where meals were prepared, garments mended, wounds tended, and children conceived. In its flickering glow, a woman's days unfolded in ceaseless repetition, each one scarcely distinguishable from the last. At first glance, the rhythms of domesticity might seem gentle, a cycle of tasks that kept the family alive and comfortable. But there was a quiet relentlessness to it, a slow erosion of the spirit that came from never leaving this circle of expectations. No matter how early she rose or how late she worked, the labor was never truly complete. Her mornings began before the sun breached the horizon. She kindled the fire from the coals saved overnight, coaxing flames from splinters of wood. She stirred the pot of thin pottage, measured out the day's flour, and listened for the first stirring of her children. If her husband was a tenant farmer, he would leave for the fields while she remained behind, responsible for everything that kept the house functioning. The animals needed fodder. The garden had to be weeded. Water had to be fetched from the well. Each journey to and fro required strength and vigilance, for there was no guarantee of safety, even so close to home. Her oldest children might help with chores, but their small hands could not lift the heaviest burdens. And if a child fell ill, or she herself did, there was no one to relieve her. Illness was no excuse for neglecting the tasks that everyone depended upon. A woman in the nobility did not escape this yoke entirely. Though servants bore much of the weight of daily labor, the lady of the house was still charged with overseeing them. Her reputation depended on maintaining order, on ensuring that bread was baked, linens washed, guests properly entertained. The standards were higher, not lower, and the consequences of failure more public. There were no holidays from duty. Even feast days required preparation: loaves to bake, candles to trim, children to dress in their cleanest smocks. A festival was another performance, another proof that she had kept her household in order, and to her life unfolded in the shadow of the hearth, the same small space her mother had labored before her. the same stones, the same smoke-dark beams, the same cold draft slipping under the door in winter. Some nights, when she bent over the fire to stir the pot, she might feel her thoughts drift beyond the narrow walls. She might remember a time when she imagined other futures, ones where she traveled to distant cities, or learned to read the books kept locked in the priest's chest, or simply walked alone along the hedgerows without a single eye upon her. But such imaginings were fleeting. The demands of the hearth always reclaimed her. A cry from the cradle, the hiss of a pot boiling over. The knowledge that she alone could not let the household falter. What dignity she possessed was tied to her capacity to endure, to keep the fire alive and the children fed. Even her moments of rest were watched. A neighbor stopping by would note whether her floor was swept, whether her garments were tidy, whether she looked weary. All were signs of her competence or her failure. It is easy, centuries later, to romanticize the simplicity of this domestic world. The image of a woman seated by the hearth, her hands busy with mending, the hush of the evening settling around her. But that quiet carried a heaviness few could have articulated. The knowledge that she would likely grow old in this same chair, her body bent by the same labors, her spirit marked by the same unseen confines. And yet, within these confines, she found small acts of defiance. A lullaby sung in her own language when Latin prayers were expected. A secret taste of honey reserved for herself before the jar was passed around. A single moment, late at night, when she rested her hands on her knees and allowed herself to think, "I am still here." These were not victories as history records them, but they were moments of survival, sparks of selfhood that glimmered even in the gloom. If you close your eyes and listen, you might almost hear her, breathing quietly beside the hearth she could never leave, feeling the ache in her bones, and finding, in her own unremarked persistence, a quiet kind of strength. The price of obedience, as dawn uncurled across the rooftops, and the crows began their solemn cries. There was a woman sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the earthen floor. She knew already how this day would unfold, because it would differ little from the one before, or the one before that. In the hush of that moment, she might have allowed herself a single breath of her own choosing before the weight of obedience descended once more. Obedience was not simply expected of her, it was the very condition of her survival. From childhood, she had been taught that a woman's virtue rested in submission. To her father first, then to her husband, to the priest who lectured her from the pulpit, to the customs that governed every gesture, every word, every silence. The church taught that this was her God-given place. Eve's transgression, they said, had made women weak, prone to sin and confusion. Only through a lifetime of discipline and humility could a woman hope to keep her soul unsullied. And so she learned early to lower her eyes when addressed, to accept rebuke without reply, to bury her opinions deep beneath the surface of her composure. In marriage, obedience became an unspoken contract. She was her husband's helpmeet, subject to his rule in all matters. If he was a kind man, her deference might be met with occasional gentleness, but kindness was a luxury, not a guarantee. The law recognized a husband's right to correct his wife with blows if he believed she had erred. A bruised cheek, a split lip, a welt across the back. These were seldom cause for outrage. They were merely reminders of her place. Even among the nobility, where fine manners were polished like silver, the principle remained unchanged. A noblewoman might preside over banquets and manage the estate in her husband's absence, but her authority was always provisional. Should he return and find her decisions wanting, her power dissolved as quickly as it was granted. For most women, obedience extended beyond their households. If a priest accused her of immodesty, She had no defense but to confess her failings. If a neighbor spread rumors of her supposed transgressions, her silence was the only acceptable response. Protest was perilous, for it suggested pride, a sin even more distasteful in a woman than in a man. In this world, a woman's worth was measured not by her intellect or her labor, but by her willingness to yield. A dutiful daughter who accepted an unwanted betrothal was praised as virtuous. A wife who endured her husband's cruelty in silence was admired for her fortitude. Even a widow, supposedly free of a man's direct authority, was expected to model restraint and humility, lest she be accused of impropriety. And yet, for all her obedience, there was no promise of security. A woman might submit in every particular and still find herself discarded if she failed to produce a son, or if her husband tired of her, or if gossip attached itself to her name like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. In some small, unrecorded moments, she must have wondered what it would feel like to decide her own fate, to walk a road of her own choosing without asking permission, to speak her mind without fearing the consequences. But these imaginings were quickly extinguished by necessity. The children needed tending. The bread must be baked. The household could not function without her steady compliance. And so she rose from her bed, smoothing the front of her worn kirtle, and began again the familiar sequence of tasks that had defined her life. If you were to look closely, past her lowered eyes and folded hands, you might glimpse something unspoken in the set of her shoulders. Not defiance, perhaps, but a quiet endurance, a knowledge that even the most compliant spirit carries its own unvoiced sorrow. It is easy, from the vantage of centuries, to judge the past and its cruelties. But in the silent hours of her day, this woman was not pondering philosophy. She was simply surviving, and survival itself was an act of both submission and astonishing resilience. So she moved through her tasks, tending the fire, washing the linens, quieting the children's squabbles, her obedience wrapping around her like a second skin. If she sometimes thought of shedding it, she never let the thought linger long. There was no room for rebellion in a life so hemmed by duty. And yet, in the soft darkness before dawn returned, perhaps she allowed herself the smallest flicker of imagining. A life where obedience was a choice, not a sentence. Where her worth was not weighed against her silence. Where the price of survival did not require the erasure of her own voice. Such dreams were as brief as candle flames in the drafty corners of her mind. But even the smallest flame can endure in the dark, waiting for the hour when it might grow. The quiet hunger of the mind. In the dim recesses of a medieval cottage, a woman might pause in her labor, her hand stilling on the spindle or the ladle. The motion of her days was so unchanging that it could blur the boundary between hours and years. Yet somewhere beneath the relentless duties, a different hunger stirred, a quiet longing to know, to understand, to lift her gaze from the small circle of her existence and glimpse something larger. For most women, this hunger remained unsatisfied. Education was a privilege reserved for men. Even among the nobility, the expectation was that daughters be taught just enough to fulfill their domestic roles, to read simple prayers, to keep household accounts, to compose a letter if need demanded. The arts of rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, these were fields closed to her. In a peasant household, the idea of schooling was even more remote. Her parents measured her value in the work she could do. The time she spent learning her letters was time stolen from the spinning wheel or the garden plot. And so she learned only what was necessary: the tally of coins owed to the landlord, the seasons of planting and harvest, the recipes her mother whispered as they prepared the daily pottage. But necessity could not always quench curiosity. There were women who snatched moments to ask questions of traveling friars or the village priest. Some learned their letters in secret, tracing crude alphabets in the dust by firelight, hoping no one would see and laugh. Some listened with rapt attention when a neighbor repeated a scrap of scripture or a tale brought from distant lands. In wealthier households, a lucky few found indulgent fathers or husbands who permitted them access to books. These volumes, bound in leather, inked with painstaking care, were treasures beyond imagining. A woman who held one in her hands felt the weight not only of parchment, but of possibility. Yet even this privilege was circumscribed. She could read the lives of saints, moral treatises, perhaps a collection of proverbs. Anything more controversial was considered unseemly, a threat to her modesty and her role. It was whispered that too much knowledge made a woman proud. That pride would lead her to question her duties, her station, the very order of the world. And so, if she was wise, or merely cautious, she curbed her curiosity. She let her hunger go unfed rather than risk the suspicion that would follow. Yet the mind, once awakened, is not easily silenced. Some women learned to find small satisfactions in the margins of their days. As she spun wool, she might recite prayers not by rote, but by reflection, considering their meaning. As she taught her children their letters, she might linger over the shapes, feeling a thrill of recognition when a word took form. As she listened to the gossip of neighbors, she might sift their stories for patterns, seeking a kind of understanding that no book could provide. This was learning in secret, an education carried out in stolen glances and unspoken thoughts. No one praised it. No one marked it in the ledgers of the parish. But it was there nonetheless, a quiet testimony to her humanity. Occasionally, a woman's hunger for knowledge grew too large to hide. In convents, certain nuns and anchoresses became scholars in their own right, composing treatises and visions that would echo through the centuries. Julian of Norwich, with her revelations of divine love. Hildegard of Bingen, with her writings on medicine, music, and theology. But these were extraordinary exceptions, and most women never heard their names. For the vast majority, the hunger remained an ache beneath the surface of ordinary life. While she stirred the pot or mended a garment, she wondered how the stars moved across the sky. What words were hidden in the books she would never open? What truths lay beyond the narrow walls of her parish? These questions did not make her life easier. If anything, they sharpened her awareness of all she was denied. But they also marked her as fully alive. Even if her body was constrained by duty, her thoughts could slip beyond the boundaries laid out for her. In the end, this hunger was both her burden and her quiet triumph. For though the world insisted that her mind be small, she carried within her the proof that it was vast, and that no hearth, no husband, no addict could wholly extinguish its flame. When the evening came and the last chore was done, she might sit in the hush of the cottage, her hands folded in her lap, and let her thoughts drift where her feet could not follow. In those moments, she knew herself to be more than the sum of her tasks, and though no one recorded her questions or celebrated her wonder, she carried them with her to the end, a hidden testament to the quiet, unquenchable hunger of the invisible toil of motherhood. In the hush that settled over a medieval dwelling at night, when the children at last succumbed to sleep and the coals burned low in the hearth, a woman might close her eyes and feel the weight of her body, aching, heavy, as though every task she had performed that day remained lodged in her bones. Motherhood was not a sentimental ideal in her world. It was an endless succession of demands, each one as inescapable as the next dawn. From the moment her first child quickened in her womb, she became bound to a cycle that would define her existence. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was both a hope and a hazard. The midwives and older women in her village murmured prayers over her swelling belly, but they also knew the unspoken truth, that every labor was a crossing over, one foot in life and one in death. There was no certainty she would survive, no guarantee the child she carried would draw breath for more than a few hours. And yet, there was no question that she would try again, because her worth was measured in children, especially sons, and because there was simply no alternative. When the hour came, she endured the agony of childbirth without aid of anesthesia or trained physicians. If she was lucky, there would be a midwife whose hands were steady, whose herbs and charms might ease her pain. If she was not, she bore her ordeal alone, or with only the frightened help of a neighbor. The sounds that filled the chamber, her cries, the rasping prayers, the tiny, fragile wails of new life, were the same sounds that had marked births for generations. Yet giving birth was only the beginning. Infancy itself was fraught with danger. Illnesses no one understood could snatch a child in a single night. A simple fever or a shallow cough might prove fatal. She learned early never to trust too fully in any small heartbeat, and so her days blurred into a ceaseless vigil. She rose before the dawn to nurse her baby, to prepare thin broth for the older children, to clean the soiled cloths, to rub tiny limbs with warm oil. She watched over their slumber and measured their breathing. She tried to protect them from chill drafts and from the silent illnesses that crept through crowded cottages. Even in households of privilege, motherhood was a consuming duty. A noblewoman might have wet nurses to feed her infants, nurses to mind them while she slept. But her responsibility was no less absolute. She was expected to ensure her children's survival, to oversee their care, to guarantee that they grew into the heirs her husband and family demanded. If she failed, if too many children died, or if she bore only daughters, whispers might grow that she was cursed, or unfit, or somehow to blame. No respite came as the children grew. A mother's labor shifted from the purely physical to the endless work of instruction and discipline. She taught them to speak, to recite their prayers, to carry out their chores. She impressed upon her daughters the same lessons of obedience she had been forced to learn. She steeled her sons for a world in which strength and aggression would be their only defenses. When her husband was absent or sullen or cruel, she bore the burden of both parents, the visible and invisible labor that no chronicler ever noted. She was the one to hush the quarrels and smooth the ruffled hair and press her lips to fevered brows. The one to explain, gently or sternly, why there was no more bread that week. The one to kneel at night and pray that the children would live until morning. If she was fortunate, she saw some of them grow tall and strong. If she was not, she dug small graves with her own hands, murmuring the words she hoped would ease their passage into the next world. Yet no matter how many times her heart broke, the duties did not pause. She rose again the next day, because she must. There were more mouths to feed, more small garments to mend, more fragile lives depending on her constancy. And in this, perhaps, lay the quietest testament to her strength. Not in grand declarations or defiance, but in the steady, unsung perseverance that underpinned every hour of her life. She was not a figure carved into history's chronicles. She left behind no monuments, no ledgers of achievement. Her legacy was the generations who survived because she endured. If you listen closely, across the centuries, you might still hear the faint echo of her lullabies, low, patient, and soft as the hush before sleep. For though her toil was invisible, it shaped the world in ways no chronicler ever cared to record. The rituals of grief and remembrance, in the quiet hours after the final candle guttered out, a medieval woman sometimes sat alone with her grief. a grief so constant it felt like a companion. Loss wove itself into the fabric of her days as intimately as hunger or weariness. Death came often in her world, and it did not discriminate. Children, husbands, parents, friends, each could be stolen away without warning, leaving her to gather up the threads of her life and continue as though nothing had unraveled. Her culture offered rituals for mourning, a scaffolding to contain her sorrow. When a child died, she prepared the small body with trembling hands, washing the delicate limbs, smoothing the hair, arranging scraps of cloth for burial. Neighbors came to murmur prayers and offer solace, but no words could soften the emptiness left behind. In noble households, mourning was marked by black garments and solemn masses. A lady might withdraw from court, her veiled head bowed in a show of piety and bereavement. She was expected to embody dignity and composure, to mourn in ways that honored the family's name. Even her grief had to be carefully measured, never spilling into the disarray that would invite gossip or censure. Among the poor, the rituals were simpler, but no less profound. A peasant woman might bury her husband in a parish grave, the priest intoning Latin phrases over a wooden coffin while she clutched her children's hands. Later, she would return to her cottage, where the absence pressed against her like a second skin. There was no luxury of retreat. Fields still needed tending. Bread still needed baking. Life demanded she carry on, however hollow she felt inside. Sometimes, grief found small, secret outlets. A mother might tuck a child's discarded toy into her apron pocket, carrying it as a talisman against forgetting. A wife might whisper her dead husband's name into the darkness before sleep. These private gestures were acts of remembrance, as necessary as any funeral rite. The church taught that suffering was redemptive, that each loss was a test of faith. She was told to trust in God's plan, to find solace in the promise of heaven. And perhaps sometimes she did. But often, her faith mingled with questions too dangerous to voice aloud. Why must a loving God take so much? Why was her heart required to break again and again? In the spaces where no priest could hear, she might have fashioned her own answers. Soft, half-formed beliefs that comforted her more than any sermon. Perhaps she imagined that her dead lingered nearby, invisible but present. Perhaps she felt them in the hush before dawn, or the flicker of the hearth's last ember. Grief shaped the rhythms of her days. In the first raw weeks, it was a roar that drowned out all other thought. Later, it became an undercurrent, subtle but insistent, a reminder that love and loss were inseparable. Over time, the rituals of remembrance wove themselves into her routine. On feast days, she lit candles for those she had lost. At the churchyard, she traced the names on headstones with a work-roughened finger. In the evenings, she told stories of the dead to the living, making sure that memory did not fade. No chronicler recorded these small ceremonies. They were not considered history, only the quiet business of women's lives. Yet in their persistence lay a kind of resistance. By tending to the memory of the departed, she asserted their worth and her own. And when her own time came, she could only hope that someone would stand at her bedside, offering the same fragile comfort she had given others, that her name would be spoken in the hush of the night. Her life recalled not for its drama or grandeur, but for the simple, enduring fact that she had loved and been loved in return. In this way, grief was not merely an affliction, but a testament, a proof that her heart had not been dulled by hardship, that even in a world that demanded her submission, she had kept some hidden portion of herself open to sorrow, to memory, to the quiet rituals of remembrance that outlasted death itself. The silent network of women, hidden beneath the visible structures of medieval society, The stone churches, the manors, the sprawling fields ran another kind of architecture, one never committed to parchment or honored with a herald's trumpet. This was the silent network of women, a web of alliances and dependencies that threaded through villages, castles, and convents alike. From her earliest years, a girl learned that she would need other women to survive. Her mother and older sisters were her first teachers, showing her how to swaddle a baby, knead dough, tend a wound. These lessons were passed on not as formal instruction, but as gestures repeated until they became second nature. When she married, she entered a new household, where she would rely on her husband's female kin to guide her through the unfamiliar rhythms of her duties. A sister-in-law might teach her the way the family liked their bread baked, or how to manage the servants without provoking resentment. An old aunt might press her hand at the threshold, a wordless reassurance that she was not entirely alone in this strange place. Among the peasantry, women's alliances were formed in the daily communion of labor. They met at the well to draw water, exchanging bits of gossip and practical advice. They gathered in each other's cottages to spin wool by candlelight, their voices murmuring over the scrape of distaff and spindle. In these moments, a kind of collective strength emerged, quiet but enduring. In noble households, alliances were more carefully negotiated, often complicated by status and ambition. Yet even there, women found ways to confide in one another. A lady-in-waiting might become her mistress's most trusted friend, privy to secrets that could never be spoken aloud in a hall full of men. Bonds formed over the long hours of embroidery or the shared anxiety of childbirth. Sometimes, this network became a lifeline in times of crisis. When a woman's husband grew violent, it was often other women who offered her sanctuary, if only for a night. When plague swept through a village, it was women who tended the sick, comforted the dying, and later washed and prepared the bodies. No one expected thanks or praise. It was simply understood that this was their part in the unending struggle to keep Iwana. Even midwives, so often targets of suspicion when things went wrong, were nonetheless indispensable. They brought babies into the world and closed the eyes of the dead. Their knowledge was not written in any learned Tuos treatise, but held in memory and passed from one generation of women to the next. There were, too, the women who sold herbs in the marketplaces or brewed ale to supplement the family's income. The laws rarely recognized their contributions, but entire communities depended on their labor. A widow who kept her children fed by spinning thread late into the night. A mother who gathered wild plants to heal neighbors' fevers. A young wife who shared what little she had with another woman abandoned by her husband. And when misfortune or scandal struck, an illegitimate birth, a failed harvest, an accusation of witchcraft, it was often the same network that closed ranks, offering practical help and discreet counsel. There was no formal oath or charter binding them together, only the simple understanding that in a world built to constrain them, their best defense was each other. To men, these relationships might have seemed trivial, even suspect. A priest or lord might scorn women's chatter as idle or dangerous. Yet in truth, these conversations were a hidden current that carried vital knowledge, comfort, and solidarity. They were what allowed a woman to endure the monotony and pain of her days, to feel less isolated in her burdens. In the hush of a cottage after the children had been put to bed, or in the dim corner of a castle solar, a woman might look into another woman's eyes and know that she was seen. Not as a wife or a mother or a servant, but as herself. And in that recognition, however fleeting, there was a kind of quiet triumph. A moment when the walls that hemmed her in seemed to dissolve, leaving only the shared understanding of what it meant to be female in a world that never fully valued her. This was the silent network that no chronicler thought worthy of recording, no scribe considered important enough to preserve. Yet it was as real and necessary as any fortress wall or royal edict. When you imagine the medieval world, do not forget this hidden architecture, the invisible web of women's alliances, woven from countless gestures of care, sympathy, and defiance. For without it, the great structures of history would have stood on hollow ground, the enduring echo of their lives. As the centuries unspooled and the medieval world receded into legend, most of the women who inhabited it left no trace beyond a name in a parish ledger or the faintest inscription on a weathered stone. Their daily labors, their heartbreaks and small triumphs, their laughter and laments, these things drifted into the past like smoke from a hearth fire. Yet in ways both subtle and profound, their lives continue to echo through time. Perhaps it is easiest to see this legacy in the quiet expectations handed down from mother to daughter, the sense of what a woman ought to be: patient, enduring, skilled in sacrifice. Medieval women did not invent these ideals, but they embodied them so thoroughly that their example calcified into tradition. Long after the last thatched roof gave way to slate and brick, long after the plague subsided and kingdoms shifted, the idea of woman as caretaker and burden-bearer remained. And yet, beneath those expectations was something else, something that persisted despite the centuries of submission. Even in the most constrained of circumstances, medieval women found ways to assert their presence. A midwife's practiced hands defying ignorance, a nun's illuminated manuscript preserving knowledge, a widow's enterprise keeping her children fed, an anchoress's visions daring to describe God in a mother's likeness. These were not gestures grand enough to fill chronicles, but they mattered. They were small acts of creation and endurance that challenged the notion that a woman's life was only valuable when it mirrored the ambitions of men. And there were those whose stories, by some rare twist of fortune, did survive the passage of time. Christine de Pizan, composing her spirited defenses of women's worth; Hildegard of Bingen, conjuring music and visions beyond the comprehension of her male contemporaries; Eleanor of Aquitaine, maneuvering with a cunning that would have been admired in any king. Their names glow in the record like embers, reminders that medieval womanhood was never a single, uniform experience. Still, for every famous figure, there were countless others who remain. The peasant mothers who buried half their children, the weavers and laundresses who never owned more than 2 garments. The girls married off before they were old enough to understand what marriage meant. Their lives have gone largely unremembered. Yet if you walk today through the ruins of an abbey or the nave of an ancient church, you might sense a presence lingering at the edge of awareness. The resonance of thousands of unseen lives, of hands that scrubbed stone floors smooth, of voices raised in whispered prayer, of hearts that dared to love despite the knowledge that loss would almost certainly follow. These echoes are not loud. They do not clamor for your attention. But if you are quiet, if you stand very still, you might feel them. Threads of memory woven into the stones beneath your feet. A collective testament to the endurance of women who were never meant to be remembered, but who shaped the course of the world all the same. In imagining their stories, we do not resurrect them fully. No modern sympathy can return what they lost or ease what they endured. But perhaps in lingering over the details of their lives, the smoky cottages, the childbirth beds, the crowded marketplaces, we offer a kind of belated witness, a recognition that these women were not footnotes to someone else's history. They were the history. It is tempting to think of the medieval world as distant, sealed behind the thick walls of time. but in truth, it is closer than we imagine. So many of our assumptions about womanhood, about power, about whose voices deserve to be heard, were born in those centuries and still cast their shadows today. If you listen carefully, you can hear those old stories still murmuring beneath our modern certainties. The refrain of women who did not expect to be honored, who never hoped their toil might be preserved in any record, yet whose quiet, unyielding perseverance became the foundation for everything that followed. As you drift into sleep, imagine them for a moment, kneeling by the hearth, pressing a child to their breast, tucking away their own dreams so others might thrive. And know that in remembering them, in letting their lives ripple through your imagination, you honor not only their sacrifices, but the countless unnamed women across history who bore the weight of the world and somehow found a way to keep going. In this dim remembrance, there is no need for grand conclusions or proclamations, only a gentle, persistent acknowledgement that they were here, that they mattered, and that, though time has swallowed their names, the echo of their existence endures.